Hello to everybody. Thank you all for joining, and thanks especially to our speakers. We're delighted and privileged to have such expertise here today. The Harmoon Centre for Contemporary Studies and the Irish Syria Solidarity Movement have come together to host this seminar to ask why the international community are to a large extent ignoring how the Assad regime has turned Syria into a leading narco-state. Captagon is sometimes referred to as the poor man's cocaine, and the trade has transformed the wealth of Bashar al-Assad and his family and Syrian warlords, and is believed to be helping him to cushion the impact of sanctions on his regime and to finance his ongoing war against the Syrian people, while creating an ever-growing drug addiction crisis across the Middle East and the Mediterranean area and threatening Europe as well. But before I introduce our speakers this evening, which we'll do in a few moments, I would just like to acknowledge that today, the 9th of December, it is 9 years since the abduction and disappearance of 4 human rights activists in Douma in Syria. Every year on this date, the Irish Syria Solidarity Movement holds a vigil for Samira, Razan, Wael and Nazem, and for all of Syria's disappeared. Tonight we are here instead, but we hold the candle for them this year and through all the years. They are missed, especially, of course, by those who love them, and they are honoured by those who care for human rights all over the world. And we continue to demand that the disappeared who are living are released and that families are informed about the fate of their missing loved ones. Our expert speakers today, we're so lucky to have them, include Caroline Rose, who's Senior Analyst at the New Lines Institute for Policy and Strategy, and co-author with Alexander Soderholm of a major, very comprehensive report on Captagon, a report which is very valuable in itself and has the added value for anyone who really wants to learn about this issue in depth of the very meticulous and comprehensive references to all the other reports and material on the issue. Caroline will provide an introduction to Captagon, its scale and evolution in Syria and the region. And then we will hear from Charles Lister, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Counterterrorism and Syria Programs at the Middle East Institute, and who's currently working on his 4th book, which is about Syria. And he will guide us through his analysis of the geopolitics of Captagon, focusing in particular on the US. Rahaf Al-Dougli, Director of Research at Harmoon Centre, on sabbatical from Lancaster University, where she is lecturer on Middle East and North African Studies, will share her knowledge of the impact of Captagon on Syrians' political attitudes and behaviour. And then our last speaker will be Ronan Tynan, who is founder of Esperanza Productions, which is a human rights filmmakers since 1995. And he's director of the recently released and multi-award winning documentary, Bringing Assad to Justice, and previously the equally admired and important film, Syria, the Impossible Revolution. And Ronan will consider the area of accountability and how the failure to address war crimes and crimes against humanity and corruption, especially by the UN, opened the door to the further industrial levels of criminality of the Captagon trade. So each speaker will speak for 7 or 8 minutes, and after that there will be an opportunity for participants to ask questions by using the raise hand function. So if you want to ask a question, you can be thinking about it and raising your hand at this time or during the speakers. So Caroline, can I ask you to kick off first, please? Thanks very much.
Certainly. Thank you so much. And thanks so much to the Harmoon Center for hosting this event and for everyone that's joining. Also, it's great to see panelists that are friends and also new friends. And I really appreciate being on today. And thank you for having me. I want to talk a bit about the background of Captagon, where it all began, the journey of it in Syria, and then, of course, where we are with the Captagon trade nowadays. I'm going to start a bit about myself. And how I even entered, the field of researching Captagon. I fell into this accidentally in 2019 when I was at the London School of Economics International Drug Policy Unit. which researches narcotics trades and their nexus with security issues across the international system. They were building out their Middle East initiative, and they were looking for a specialist on security and defense issues. That was my background. I didn't know too much about narcotics trades, but entered IDPU looking to learn a bit more about narcotics trends and patterns in the Middle East. At the time, like many of you, I didn't know what Captagon was. And Captagon was a word at the time that was closely affiliated with a number of terrorist organizations, notably Daesh, the Islamic State. And at the time, this research project began to really determine and look at the relationship between the Islamic State and the Captagon trade. But pretty soon, about into the spring and summer of that year of research, we started to identify new trends in the Captagon trade that indicated not only an industrial size, but also the very close affiliation with the Syrian regime on both sides of production and smuggling. And in that summer of 2019 into 2020, we started to really closely monitor seizures and data and also laboratory analysis of Captagon that tracked it, the majority of Captagon seizures back into Syria, especially into regime-controlled areas of Syria, that determines a very close-knit affiliation between Syrian regime officials and Captagon production and smuggling. This, of course, culminated in an April 2022 report called The Captagon Threat that I co-authored with my colleague, Alexander Soderholm, and then also culminated into a larger project now at the New Lines Institute that focuses on the Captagon trade, how it evolves, and what type of regional challenges it poses in the Middle East. Now, I want to, of course, now turn to what is Captagon in the first place, because I think that there are a number of myths and assumptions about Captagon that it's important, of course, to, I think, debunk. There are a lot of different aspects of Captagon, but I want to start out with the fact, with what it is. It is an amphetamine type stimulant, typically called ATS, and its effects are a lot like Adderall or Ritalin, where there's a euphoric rush, it keeps you up late, it staves hunger, it induces productivity, and it gives you kind of this euphoric feeling, whether you could use it recreationally or you could use it to, for example, work a second shift or try and save your next meal. Where did this all begin? In the 1960s in Germany, where a pharmaceutical company called Degussa AG, the Degussa Pharma Group, made a substance called phenethylene for illicit pharmaceutical production. It was, of course, prescribed by doctors for a number of different disorders, psychological disorders, attention deficit disorders, sometimes even for weight loss. And the commercial name was Captagon, with a capital C. Now, this substance, over time, there were other competitors that emerged on the illicit market, and it was scheduled in the mid-1980s. And that's when we started to see a shift to illicit production, primarily in the post-Soviet space in the Balkans, particularly in Bulgaria. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Captagon at the time was seen as a party drug. The formula very much stayed and remained phenethylene. It was used in the 1990s, kind of like rave culture, but then demand started to slide. A number of counter narcotics raids began in the Balkans, and the trade continued to shift. At this time, also, there was a close scientific relationship with a number of Bulgarian pharmacists and scientists and Syrian scientists. And this is where, at least we estimate, that the shift to Syria, the shift to Levant began. It first went into Turkey. There were a number of seizures, and there's a large pool of evidence that Captagon really was embedded in Turkey for a while, but then very soon in the early 2000s shifted into Syria. Syria, of course, has a number of conducive conditions for Captagon production and smuggling. The fact, of course, that in its heyday, it was a major pharmaceutical hub in the region, but then also along the Syrian and Lebanese border, there are proven smuggling routes that make Captagon production small scale, mobile, and conducive to large scale manufacturing and smuggling activities. Now I want to talk a bit about where, since the early 2000s, how Captagon has evolved into the trade that we see today. For a time, Captagon production was very small scale. You can make it in a basement, you can make it in a residence. You only need a few tableting tools and, of course, a basic scientific knowledge of how you can, of course, compile these amphetamine type substances and cutting agents into a tablet. Because of that, Captagon was primarily produced by local leaders, smugglers, those affiliated with Hezbollah, and then some government affiliated warlords and narco entrepreneurs. But then, of course, this was all exacerbated when the Syrian civil war began, and we started to see Captagon used as an alternative source of revenue that, of course, can be used to fund militant activities, could be used to fund livelihoods, and, of course, pad the pockets of corrupt officials. Around, about 5 or 4 years into the civil war, we started to see evidence, of course, of ISIS using Captagon as a source of revenue, along with a number of other smuggling activities, such as smuggling oil and smuggling antiquities. This, of course, was still small scale, but it did receive a lot of media hype. We started to see headlines like Captagon as, a narco substance. You started to see headlines that would characterize ISIS fighters using Captagon to perpetrate crimes against communities. We started to see a lot of media buzz about this. And around this time, this is when I and my co-author, Alex, embarked on our own research to really characterize that relationship and see if there were other actors engaged in this trade. Roughly around 2018 and 2019, we started to see signs that this was more than, of course, just ISIS production and smuggling efforts. We also started to see the expansion of the Captagon trade into ports that belong to the European Union, into the Gulf, and beyond kind of the typical contours of the Captagon trade and destination markets. And this is when we started to see the size of Captagon shipments go from just a few hundred to thousands to hundreds of thousands and sometimes in the millions. Notably, and I think that my panelists here will agree, there was a wake-up call in July 2020 with the Port of Salerno seizure, when Italian authorities seized a historically record-breaking amount of amphetamine-type substance, which of course was Captagon, found in cardboard cylinders that they deemed initially was smuggled by ISIS. But we found that it was dispatched from the port of Latakia, which we all know is regime operated and controlled almost exclusively, something that ISIS fighters could not access, and also the size of which ISIS could not produce even over months. So it was very notable at that time that this was a clear sign that the regime was actively involved, either directly or passively, with Captagon production and smuggling efforts. And then, of course, over the years, these seizures began to become more frequent, they began to grow, and we started to see evidence of Captagon production sites, both big and small, scattered across Syria, particularly in regime-controlled areas. Also, in addition to along very key strategic smuggling routes near the Syrian and Lebanese border, as well as the Syrian-Jordanian border, and recently the Syrian-Iraqi border. Because of this, of course, this has culminated in a number of different research projects that have documented the Syrian regime's active involvement in the Captagon trade. Also, individuals that are very closely aligned, very deep within the Assad regime and Assad family's inner circle, individuals like Taher al-Kayali and a number of others that are narco entrepreneurs, have created shell companies that allow Captagon smuggling facilitation activities, also coordinate with other officials and militants in outside countries, such as Hassan Mohammed Dako in Lebanon, using outside ports, using outside resources and tools to traffic Captagon to destination countries. And I'm sure people who might be familiar with the Captagon trade know that in destination countries in the GCC, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the number of Captagon shipments have increased, the size of them have increased, but also the smuggling techniques have become more and more advanced. And as we've seen more media attention and more concern about the Captagon trade, we've also seen a change in the tactics and the strategy of the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime, their interior ministry has become more vocal about Captagon seizures, Of course, none of these are as large as the seizures that we're seeing pop up in GCC destination countries. We're starting to see officials talk a bit more about counter-narcotics efforts, a Say No to Drugs campaign at home. But these are all cosmetic measures pushed by the Syrian government to try and detract blame and shift the blame on other actors, particularly opposition figures within the country. Now, I'm going to quickly wrap up and talk a bit about where the Captagon trade stands today. The Captagon trade is not just confined, of course, to Syria. We're starting to see production nodes expand beyond Syria. We're starting to see networks strengthen, particularly within Lebanon and Jordan, and also Iraq. We're starting to see new destination countries, as well as new transit countries that are used to smuggle Captagon beyond just the Mediterranean and the Gulf. And this should be concerning to policymakers and, of course, analysts alike. Just this past week, we did have a very welcome development with the passing of the NDAA with the House. They're expecting the Senate to pass this next week. And within the NDAA, that includes a provision to monitor and establish an interagency process to monitor the Captagon trade and disrupt the Captagon trade in Syria. But I want to say that this is just a first step. I think that there's a long road ahead of us. And as we start to seek to disrupt the Captagon trade, how the regime, of course, is implicated with the Captagon trade and other moves to improve coordinated collaborative efforts in the region to ensure that both demand and supply are addressed.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Thanks, that was very comprehensive. Thanks very much. And we'll move straight away to Charles, if that's okay. Charles, can I ask you to contribute?
Sure. Sure, absolutely. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all of the organisers for putting this important event together. I'll try to be brief and be concise. But there's obviously a lot to address. But on the geopolitical side, I think for me, for the last decade or so, policy conversations, analytical conversations around Syria and Syria policy have often focused on the issue of symptoms and root causes. And obviously, most often we've come to the conclusion that the international community has done fairly well at times at treating symptoms, not particularly well at treating the root causes of Syria's crisis. For me, in 2022, nearly 2023, sat here, Captagon is the leading, most significant, most blatant symptom of Syria's crisis today of geopolitical relevance, particularly in how clear its linkage is to the ultimate root cause of the crisis, which is and remains the regime. And so when we're addressing the question of why is the international community not doing more about this symptom, I think that question, takes on so much more relevance when we have addressed symptoms like ISIS, symptoms like chemical weapons usage, much more effectively and with much more determination than we're willing to do until now when it comes to drugs. But similarly, talking about this within the geopolitical realm, I think we have to sort of underline the scale of what we're talking about here. In 2020, roughly $3.5 billion worth at sale of Syrian-made Captagon was seized abroad. That was just what was seized abroad. In 2021, that number was almost double that. And according to at least conversations I've had with folks within a number of governments who work on organized crime and drug smuggling from conflict zones, so this is where it gets interesting, I suppose. So 18 months ago or so, most of those conversations were suggesting to me that when you look at what was seized and then trying to extrapolate, therefore, what was the whole scale of the trade, the assessments were that the seizures were probably worth about 15 to 20% of the total trade. Much more recent conversations, literally in the last 2 or 3 months, with most of those same officials, including some here in the US, suggest it's actually probably only 5 to 10%. So when you take into consideration that nearly $6 billion of Captagon was seized in 2021, the actual number of the trade is absolutely astronomical. And when you compare that to the scale of, for example, the Mexican cartels, we're double, triple, potentially quadruple the scale of what the Mexican cartels are producing and exporting from Mexico. So geopolitically wise, this is enormous, unprecedented in scale. And so again, we ask ourselves the question as to why it's not being tackled more determinedly. Looking at the region, Saudi seizures continue, I think, to exponentially rise. I think we've seen an increase in the number this year in Turkey and Iraq. As I understand, also now we're seeing new flows through North Africa. Early signs that markets or new markets are beginning to emerge, particularly again in the Middle East. Jordan is the clearest example of that, where that is now being described as an epidemic in use of Syrian Captagon. So Jordan has evolved from being a transit point to a market of its own. And of course, public health and national security implications of that are enormous. Now, I've had some conversations just in the last few weeks, and I understand that although not public, there have been small-scale seizures in the last few months of Syrian Captagon in Israel and in the West Bank, which, you know, given the enormous amount of security around Israeli borders, to me is fascinating and suggests that pre-existing smuggling networks from southern Lebanon into Israel are now being mobilized in the Captagon trade. So this is truly becoming something that is, I think, probably crossing borders we didn't necessarily expect it to, even maybe a year ago. So in terms of the regime, I think there's no way to know precisely how much the regime is directly benefiting from this, but the scale makes the fact that it's benefiting inevitable. But more importantly, I think, and in terms of looking at this question that we're talking about today, I think it also exemplifies the interdependency between the regime, the crony elite, loyalist security institutions. The Captagon has become, I think, the core glue that ties those three institutions of the regime's state together: the regime, the crony elite, and loyalist security units. It's, I think, beginning to be public knowledge that these fairly significant internationally designated Syrian businessman is now the core cog in terms of controlling checkpoints within Syria through which the Captagon, the industrial scale smuggling shipments travel through. And I think, again, that it indicates the importance of the business community in this narco-state. Now, briefly to answer the questions in terms of why are we not seeing so much effort, I think in the region, there is a determination to focus on this issue, but there is a determination to focus on it quietly, mostly covertly, and specifically domestically. The idea of there being some kind of regional cooperation mechanism to counter Syrian Captagon is, we're a long way away from that. And that is mostly because drug use remains a significant taboo issue in most Middle Eastern societies, as does, and this is probably more significant, the fact that particularly on the Jordanian border, the scale of Captagon transits across the border is a reality only because of the embedded nature of border corruption. The idea that 5 to 10% is being seized and 90 to 95% is getting through is only a reality because of that embedded corruption on the border. There are border officials, not junior folks, but senior people who are permitting this trade to continue. And so clearly dealing with that on a domestic level, let alone a regional one, is a complicated issue to expect. In Europe, frankly speaking, European policy when it comes to this issue is much more concerned about refugees. And frankly, conversations I've had on this issue have revealed quite a bit of skepticism as to whether the regime is really complicit in this drugs trade at all, which is surprising and frustrating. When it comes to the US, it would be incorrect, I think, to say that the US hasn't done anything, but the few things they have done are covert. So there is now a DEA team in Jordan dedicated to the Captagon trade. There is a JSOC, Special Operations Command Task Force, that is in part dedicated to this very issue. And both of those are based in Jordan. There continues to be a significant amount of intelligence collection through our existing networks inside Syria, most of whom throughout the past decade, most of our intelligence networks have been based within the smuggling industry, so to speak. So this actually gives the US a significant insight into this trade, but it's covert and it's intelligence, it's not public. information. On the overt side, that's where it's been a lot more troubling, I would say. In late 2021, the Captagon Amendment that is in this year's NDAA found itself mysteriously removed from the previous drafts of the NDAA in late 2021. In April 2022, the State Department released an assessment, a public assessment of the Assad family's wealth, which it placed at between 1 to 2 billion. Now, when you look at Maher al-Assad's role within the Captagon trade, that number is laughable. So clearly we weren't publicly acknowledging the Captagon trade at that point. And in September this year, the State Department's list of major drug transit or major illicit drug producing countries again failed to include Syria, despite the fact that it is from Syria that we're seeing the biggest in terms of scale drug production and drug export in the world. So recent news just in the last 24 hours that the Captagon Act has been included within the NDAA and is expected to pass through Senate is a big change, but it's a change that forces the Biden administration to act on this issue. They're not choosing to. They quite clearly don't want to have to tackle this issue because it would mean that Syria would need to become a much more significant item on the public foreign policy agenda. And it would force us to do an awful lot more than we want to be doing on Syria writ large. Syria is an issue that this administration wants to keep at arm's length. It wants to contain the Syrian crisis, not invest in trying to fix it, given the sheer amount of resources that we would need to accomplish such a goal. So to close out, the trajectory is really troubling on this issue, and not just for Syria and for Syrians. I have a feeling that Jordan's evolution from being a transit point to a market may have some ripple effects more broadly in the region. But I think most of that will take place behind closed doors rather than publicly.
Thank you, Charles. And both of you are showing the scale of this. As you say, it's unprecedented. It's enormous. And the fact that it's being effectively really ignored, I suppose that's part of the reason why ourselves and Harmoon wanted to have this event and have people like yourselves name it. And I know you are naming it, but it's an extra, I suppose, opportunity to do so, to confront what is not happening around this. The human cost of it alone, let alone the cost in funding the regime and the security implications. It's mind-boggling that it's not being dealt with. So Rahaf, I think you're going to bring us to Syria and to the impact of it there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leonie, and thanks for everyone here. And special thanks actually also goes to, I want to extend my special thanks to my colleagues, Zaid and Basil, for organizing all of this for the last 3 weeks and for putting up with me also, because I thought like in the last 3 days that I won't be able to join for some major health issues. But anyway, I'm here today. So I will start actually like currently what brought me to the idea of Captagon and the idea of drugs and civil wars. When I was in the US, when I spent my fellowship there, I kind of had to go through archives of Colombia, Mexico, and all the peace deals of the 55 peace deals that happened of the latest civil wars since after the Cold War. And really what's really important that the failure or the tracker of the failure of these peace deals always kind of goes line in line with the drug issues, especially in Mexico, Cuba, and other countries. And this brought me to the fact, especially after when Syria became more of attracted the global attention in terms of the Captagon trade. And this brought me to who is really responsible. First, we have a few questions here. Who is really responsible for this Captagon trade or the drug or the illicit economies that we have in Syria? Second, actually, it's not really, even if we knew who is really responsible for that, it's not enough to contain that issue or to solve it. We have now we know the regional, and as Charles said just a few minutes ago, about the regional dynamics, the complexity of the Syrian case actually goes with that. There are many regional actors involved here, and especially when in these peace deals, especially in Mexico, especially with the FARC and Cuba and even Afghanistan, when there was more of a counterinsurgency or counter-narcotic criticism by the government and even Taliban. There has been more of a manipulations of the drug use by both parties and the all warring parties. And the one thing that really happened is that each warring party was using the drug, these illicit economies in order to sustain its authority and also power over the populations. Now, I think it's not even enough for, as I said, like we have to learn some lessons from from many cases that happened. Like before, Syria is not an exception, and it's not the first country that has, because of the civil war, that the drug, the illicit economies that have become widespread. And I think more of a simple answer to the questions why the world has turned a blind eye for the illicit economies in Syria, it's sometimes because the international communities and its geopolitical, it's also geographical positioning. So, for example, we see the U.S. policies towards Mexico, and Cuba was the implementations of counter-narcoticism was much stronger than when we see the case in Syria. As Charles said, that we have Jordan, we have Turkey, we have many other, these regional actors, sometimes we can say, and I can't say it here now, but they are accomplice in that kind of drug trafficking in a way. So I think the most of the kind of we need to have more of a holistic approach, like including all warring parties. So even if we think that the regime is the one responsible for this kind of illicit economies, but at the same time we know as well that all militias in Northeast and Northwest, they are also accomplice, and there is evidence of that. For example, SDF is turning also a blind eye on these illicit economies. Another thing that I want to talk about is actually Syrians' opinion about Syrians' perceptions of this drug use. And actually last week we launched at Harmon Center more of a surveys that attracted, like the responses were not like, it was more of a pilot study for our future, for our research in 2023. And it's quite interesting that for the first time, because I'm more an expert on national identities and how fractured societal dimensions can be not solved, but maybe we can transition to societal peace in post-conflict era. And for the first time, I can see Syrians' responses from different regions, even those within the regime-controlled areas and in Idlib. They have quite similar responses to the drug use. So, for example, we had responses highlighting that the Syrians are not quite sure if the regime is, I'm not saying here Syrians, but the respondents, they are not quite sure if the regime is doing that purposely, and even if they are doing it purposely, that maybe they are unable to have any to implement counter narcoticism. For example, only until 1993, the Syrian regime implemented a drug law, which is a criminalization of drug use. And I think that's quite just after the Lebanese civil war, because the international community, when they signed the Taif peace deal, they found, before signing that, they found that the Syrian regime is accomplice in trading in these illicit economies. So the international community posed more of a pressure on the Syrian regime to criminalize or to criminalize drug. Actually, after the 1993 and after 2011, the Syrian war, the regime did not. I tried to see if they are publicly try to minimize or more of a force on the society for the drug use. Actually, they, for the first time, the Syrian official narrative, the regime narrative, started to have more of a cooperation with non-governmental organization. and there is more of 8 non-governmental organizations within regime-controlled areas. They are carrying more of a workshops on the impact of using drugs. Now, why this is important, as me coming as a Syrian, for me, actually, I can see that this, especially after doing this survey, I found that this is the least polarized narrative among Syrians. So all Syrians from different regions within regime-controlled areas in Idlib and in Hasakeh, in Latakia and in Aleppo, they stand together against the use of drugs or the manipulation of the use of drugs within Syria. And I think this kind of very much similar to the Irish, to Ireland civil war. I've been reading some research on that the militias or those who are the warlords who were the military leaders who were in the Irish army, in the post-conflict, after the peace deal, the Irish community rejected them because they were accomplice in some also drug trafficking. And I think this is really important because if we want to construct more of a pluralistic narrative to reconstruct the Syria, the war memory or the memory of the war, it's important that Syrians at some point, and especially now, that they come together to stand against all warring parties, including the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, its militias, the Iranian-backed militias, and also those who are the non-governmental, the non-state actors. Now, I want to finish in some of the policy recommendations that I think that they are quite needed for us to, or for policymakers when they are tackling the issue of the illicit economies in Syria. Now, as I said, like whether in Cuba, in Afghanistan, and also in Colombia, there has been more of a violent governance paradigm that was being implemented to end the drug trafficking or these illicit economics. However, these measures and strategies to combat these illicit economies must be understood as profoundly as political efforts and not as security. I am against using it as a security effort because these kind of securitized narrative will pose more of threats on society. Because now when we think of the Syrian conflict, even when, for example, SDF or HTS or any other warring or militias want to have more of tackle the issue of the drug trafficking, because of the war and because of the economic sanctions, these efforts cannot be more of implemented when you have it's become more of societal and things that many individuals are more accomplice in that. So the efforts.
Can you just go too close? If you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm gonna finish. So also a more of effective focus is required to address drug markets in different Syrian conflict zones, not only in regime-controlled areas, both to reduce the potential of the drug trade contributing to fueling or prolonging the conflict. I want to also it still needs to be asked whether or not the drug policy community, especially now I'm talking about the international community, has those lessons learned from different contexts like Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico. So, for example, also Syrians in diaspora and policymakers and even donors have to think of credible alternative livelihood from the legitimate economy that it's become more crafted for militias group whose expertise is moving illicit narcotics across difficult terrain, or trying to more having a holistic approach towards narcoticism, and especially when we are talking about DDR programs, which has more to offer. Through DDR, practitioners have so far, for example, in in other contexts, failed to see the relevance of these debates, like including civil organizations, non-governmental organizations, and all in all the violence, in order to tackle the issue of narcoticism and become more of to create more of a establishing or a lasting peace in Syria. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I'm sorry to all the speakers, we could listen to you for a great deal longer and you have a lot to say, but it's just trying to keep it within the time. So Ronan, can I move to you and ask you to make your contribution?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank my three previous speakers for very informative contributions, and just specifically on Captagon. I think we're very lucky today to have Caroline and Charles, who probably are two of the best informed people, and I certainly learned something today as well as somebody trying to follow this issue. But for me, one of the huge issues to emerge once again is the complete and utter failure of international law as it's currently under the current paradigm to address these issues. Now, we all know, of course, that the UN Charter, created after the Second World War, really is geared toward protecting state sovereignty, borders, and the collectivity of state security, with no real focus on the individual, on human security. Now, in fairness, in recent decades, and I will speed it up just to allow some time for questions, we've seen some significant inroads in the area of human rights, which actually undermine this paradigm of the sanctity of state security. But really, if we are to address issues like the Captagon crisis, and more specifically, the whole issue of so-called new wars like Syria, we must move away from a situation where state security takes precedence over human security. And unless we arrive at a situation where human security is given the same kind of legal protection, and very quickly, not to become too tangled up in definitions, but what do I mean by human security? The best definition I got was from Christine Chinkin and Mary Calder. Mary Calder was interviewed in Bringing Assad to Justice. And in fact, one of the reasons I was so keen to make that documentary with my distinguished colleague Anne Daly was because I wanted to go into this whole business of human security versus state security. But of course, you see no real reference to that in the documentary because you can't theorize in a documentary. But the point is, if we want a solution to these problems, we must give people that kind of protection. And just to, not to digress, and Julie, but I really want to give you a definition of what I mean by human security. We in the West, in the United States, in the European Union, Japan, and so forth, we do enjoy human security. It's the protection given to people who are lucky enough to live in some kind of representative democracy where the rule of law is paramount. Now, that should be the basis. That should have global protection. We see in Syria, for example, that the protection of the sovereignty of Syria has allowed the Assad regime to misappropriate UN aid on an absolutely enormous scale. In fact, one can make a very credible argument that if the UN had been legally prevented from giving control by in the form of a legal agreement to the Assad regime in 2012, the resources which helped sustain that regime would not have been provided, and the oxygen for the terror and the tyranny that it has managed to inflict on the population since then was laid bare. But as we've heard very eloquently from Charles and Caroline, Captagon is now also contributing enormously to doing that. And the importance of human security, or giving human security some type of legal guarantee under international law, is uniquely illustrated by the Captagon crisis, because Joel Rayburn recently describes the Syria regime as the cartel. The government of the state is the cartel. Pablo Escobar only dreamed of that situation. I mean, he actually tried to sort of negotiate with the Colombian government to give him an approximation of that at one point by offering to clear the national debt. But in Syria, we see the regime able to profit from a burgeoning drug crisis across the Middle East because there is no protection for the citizenry versus the state. So Assad is protected by the United Nations. It's amazing. Our international legal machinery, created after the Second World War, gives this cartel boss international legal protection to carry out his business. I mean, think about that. This is the ultimate indictment of our current international legal paradigm, and we've got to reform it. But in this particular case, also, it's very important to bear in mind that not alone is Assad able to deny human security to his own people, he is able to export misery on a continental-wide basis across the Middle East through the export of the drugs. And Charles illustrated quite well the geopolitical significance. But in the Middle East, we see, for example, Saudi Arabia in particular, not wanting to give any advantage to Iran by singularly identifying Hezbollah as the cause of the problem, trying to ignore the fact that the root of the problem lies in Syria. Now, Caroline did illustrate as well how there are new manufacturing bases emerging. But again, we see this legal deficit. We see this complete failure to address a situation that effectively prevents us from giving ordinary citizens in the Middle East the protections that we enjoy. And as I say, that can really only take place if we have a revolution in international law. Now, the Calder-Chinkin book, I would recommend to anybody who's really interested in this issue, because Javier Solana wrote an introduction to that book, repeating almost a cliche, which we would particularly be aware of, that in no way does the current paradigm address what is happening in Syria. We see it replayed again in Ukraine, where international law is not even a factor in Russian considerations. And again, that's the kind of revolution we really need. I suppose essentially what we're really talking about is placing human rights right at the heart of the international legal machinery, giving precedence to the protection of the individual, families, communities in that context, rather than the state. Because as I say, the UN in particular has been reduced to, in this particular case, a sort of cartel protection body. And this bizarre situation, when you think about it, is absolutely, is so shocking that part of my frustration and why I was so grateful to Charles, to Caroline, and to Rafa and her colleagues at the Harboon Centre and my friends in the Syria Ireland movement for agreeing to do this is because as I say, in not highlighting Captagon and the fact that the regime is driving it, we are missing a unique opportunity to illustrate the root of what led to the current human catastrophe that we witness today in Syria. Now, I could go on quite a long time about this, and I've tried to resist the temptation to go into detail and technicalities, but I would strongly recommend this book by Christine Chinkin and Mary Calder, who I've met. And as I said, Mary, we interviewed in Bringing Assad to Justice, and she spoke about new wars in that context. And in fact, I even berated them for not promoting this book enough, which, by the way, is the result of 5 years research, a major research project. One might even describe it as their life's work. In fact, it still annoys me, and I'm going to do something about this book. I think it needs a documentary within itself, a short documentary, to illustrate the significance of the point that's made here. Because if we're serious about preventing corrupt dictatorships becoming drug cartels, we are going to have to address the urgent need to give serious legal protection to human security, which I admit does require a serious, not just a paradigm shift perhaps, but a revolution in the way we think and look at international law under the UN today. Thanks very much.
Leonie, you're muted, I think.
Thank you. I was just thanking Ronan for speaking with his usual passion about justice and accountability. And that piece you said about that the UN has been reduced to a cartel protection body is really quite powerful. That in fact, that is one way of framing what has happened. So we actually are up to about 10 minutes before the time at which we are to end. So I'm just wondering if there's anybody among the participants. We have a couple of questions in, but if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question, if you raise your hands, I'll try to get to you. But there are a couple of questions we have already. There's a question here from our own Valerie Hughes, actually just wondering, Caroline, if you could address the question about Interpol and Syria engagement, and does that not make really a sham of any international efforts to counter narcotics fight against Captagon when you have the Syrian regime actually, if you like, sitting in on the organization that's role it is to do that? Would you have anything to say in response to that? And this is addressed to Caroline in particular, or anybody else on the panel indeed. Come in on that. Oh,
we lost her.
Okay. We're also being asked about would it, or to what extent would it be true to say that without the income from the drugs trade, the Assad regime would be greatly hampered in continuing its war against the Syrian people, particularly in Idlib and the north of Syria? So to what extent
I'm happy to.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd be happy to fire away at that one.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer the first one about the non-governmental.
Caroline, we lost you there. So would we maybe go to you first, Charles? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I actually think this is an interesting question about the income and the relation to the regime's ability to operate. I think it's an interesting question because, as I tried to imply in my opening comments, it's virtually impossible to have open source information or evidence that the scale of this drugs trade is directly feeding the state. I mean, so far, most of the assumptions we can have about this issue is that it's as much as it's integrally linked to the regime and the kind of crony elite beneath it. I don't think we have almost any evidence necessarily to say that money is therefore going to the Syrian Arab army and its ability to pay salaries or to purchase ammunition or what have you. Frankly speaking, my personal assumption is it's probably not. And the most it might be doing is paying some salaries through some de facto warlords, but that's more in terms of stationary, holding territory rather than frontline forces. But from my perspective, that makes this even more significant because, every news story virtually you read about Syria today in the mainstream media is about the dire state of the economy, the fact that we're entering a winter with no fuel and food prices higher than they've ever been. And, an average government salary is worth about $20 a month, whereas the cost to feed a family of 4 or 5 is about $300 a month. All of that is existing right now, whilst the integral structures within the regime and that crony elite are raking in tens of billions of dollars a year into their own coffers, not into the state's budget. The state budget for 2023 has declined again for next year, and almost all of the subsidies have either been cut or frozen. So I actually think that reverse answer actually makes this even more significant rather than vice versa.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. And Caroline, can I come back to you on the other question?
Yes, absolutely. And apologies for my internet connection. I don't know why, but our office Wi-Fi is being very finicky today. So my apologies. Regarding the Interpol question, and I think it's a very important one because Interpol over the last few years has been a very important mechanism through Operation Lionfish, which of course conducts a number and coordinates a number of information sharing operations and interdiction operations with a number of narcotics, but particularly related to Captagon. But recently, we found, particularly with the influence of the United Arab Emirates, which of course is pursuing normalization with the Syrian regime, Syrian regime officials have been invited to the table to discuss Captagon interdiction efforts, intelligence sharing, and law enforcement efforts to counter the trade, quite literally giving them a seat at the table for these discussions and planning and strategy sessions. There was one that was notably held during Anti-Drug Week, Anti-Drug International Day Against Drugs on, I believe, June 26th or June 28th this past summer. And that, I think, is a notable example of how normalization has encouraged Syria to come back into the fold through one actor and, of course, become involved in the very operations that it is perpetrating in the Middle East. So I think this is a very concerning development. Also, of course, the inclusion of Syria into Interpol's information and notification system also rings a number of alarm bells. And this is something that we need to, I think, account for, especially when we look for mechanisms that encourage intelligence sharing, tip-offs, and coordination over interdictions of Captagon shipments to ensure that the Syrian regime is not involved in these discussions and these processes, and that only countries, transit and destination countries that should be trusted should be included in these processes.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer, Caroline. Is there anybody else on the panel who wants to comment on either of those questions? I've got another couple of questions. I know we're coming right up to time.
I can answer the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the first one is really an important one from my perspective. It's quite, it does talk a lot about the post-conflict era in Syria and whether civil society can be brought together, whether in regime-controlled areas and outside, together to build more of a constructive narrative about how to be against these illicit economies. Actually, especially in the last year, for example, the regime in regime-controlled areas, the regime has given some space, which is important for NGOs to implement some workshops and to raise awareness about drugs, and this kind of give it a more of actually that these non-governmental organizations have the space to have these activities that they couldn't have it before. We have especially the Nabd al-Shabab volunteer team, where it's the first time in Syria where we have a non-governmental organization that operates freely and I think this can be more in post-conflict Syria, hopefully, that we will have more of this civil organization work together both inside Syria and outside to tackle this. And this is what I was talking about, the reconstruction of the war memory, that you have a more of a collective mechanism to tackle the illicit economies and the drug abuse in Syria, that all Syrians can come together to tackle that. I can also say, and as I said before, I think it's more important to bring together, and I think from reviewing these 55 civil wars, and especially with these countries that has dealt with drugs before, unless all warring parties sit on the negotiating table and discuss how to tackle the drug use, we are not gonna have to establish. We cannot establish a lasting peace. Thank you.
And if I can just ask one last question, because I know we're right up to the end, and maybe I'll aim this first of all at you, Ronan, where the question is about accountability, really, and what are the opportunities or the possibility of accountability for Bashar based on historical experience with other dictators, in particular in Latin America and Eastern Europe. And this is from Abdel Razak Moaz, and he's saying that he had interviews with his history experts in these regions. They said it wasn't possible to bring those leaders' crimes to court. And I know this is your passion, so if you'll unmute.
Oh, sorry. Any leader who is alleged to commit war crimes or crimes against humanity, when he's in office or she's in office, enjoys sovereign immunity, as we all know. But when they leave office, of course, they are open to prosecution. And in bringing Assad to justice, I did not meet a single international lawyer specializing in that area who did not think at some stage Assad will face justice if he lives long enough. Unfortunately, given the way international law is structured at the moment, it will take a long time, but it will. I have absolutely no doubt it will happen. And there is no reason why these leaders they don't enjoy immunity, as I say, once they leave office. That's just a basic fact. Even the former Serbian leader who died in The Hague, many thought he would never face prosecution. But sure enough, he did face justice. And indeed, as I say, I confidently expect Assad to go the same way. But unfortunately, it may take some time.
Okay, anybody else want to contribute on that? Just, on that issue of accountability, I suppose it's perhaps in a way the drugs trade actually opens the possibility of other avenues to accountability. That people can actually be pursued for their criminal activity rather than for their human rights abuses. So
I think that when you see experts like Charles and Caroline and so forth, and if it gets more media attention, it brings a kind of opprobrium on the regime, which makes Captagon a political issue, and it's much easier to make the case for accountability. And this is one of why it's so important, and why that recent act in the United States, which the more attention it gets, the more significant the pressure will be to address this, because unfortunately it's a sad case that many people seem not to be moved by mass slaughter, but they do get upset about drug barons getting, shall we say, selling drugs. So perhaps on that basis, it may excite certain constituencies who get to become more politically involved in this issue, and we can only hope that. So I think if one really wants to help the human rights situation in Syria, this is a remarkably effective way of bringing it back on the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
If I have 1 minute, I would just, if you wanted somebody else's voice, I would just highlight another aspect to the conversation around accountability is the still possible prospect that the Syrian people will eventually, in their own way, say, "Khalas, enough is enough. We're at a complete standstill with no light at the end of the tunnel. We have to have some form of change." And that is probably more likely to take the form of some kind of a coup rather than another uprising or a revolution. But despite all the talk about regional re-engagement and normalization, almost all of that has been symbolic until this stage. It hasn't transformed the Syrian economy. There's no direct investment into Syria to reconstruct. And there's really no prospect for that happening anytime in the future either. No sensible investor would see the regime-held Syria as a valuable or worthwhile or safe investment. And you need only look at the state of the Syrian economy, and it's very easy to predict that it is going to continue to deteriorate. And eventually, that reality will become unacceptable. And I don't think we'll see a nationwide uprising again. The change is much more likely to be more internally driven. But I do think, and I increasingly think that we're going to head in that direction. Whether it's 6 months from now or 5 years, I think is open to question. But the trajectory is only bad. And no leader, no matter how brutal they are, I think can hold on to power on that kind of a trajectory.
Yeah.
If I may say something, Lenny, on that, and following Charles, what he said, and actually it's, just 1 minute. I think this is really important when it comes that Syrians will lead their ways and that Syrians will have the agency to. And I think one of the most important thing that I saw in the surveys when we conducted these surveys among Syrians, that again, I would repeat that all Syrians, among all the different political orientations and political attitudes and political judgment that they have, whether they live in regime-controlled areas or in Idlib, they all have the same opinion on drugs. So this can be like a way forward for transitional justice and accountability against all warlords, all militia leaders, all non-governmental, non-state actors, and also including the regime. And I think, as we said around today, that all Syrians, and especially from this survey, that all Syrians are fed up with this illicit economy that has been going on from all warring parties. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's, I think, going to be our final word, because I'm conscious that people have other places to go and we're over time. And it's those last two contributions, it's like from your mouth to whoever's listening in terms of what happens next. Because, you know, I suppose one of the things that really strikes me about the billions of dollars is none of it is going back into Syria. None of it is feeding Syrians. None of it is being invested back into, and in fact, it would be very wise of the regime to invest it back in, but none of that is happening. It's causing misery, not in Syria and in the region. And it's not even being used to allay, you know, the other misery that's there. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here this evening. Thanks to Harmoon and the people behind the scenes for making it all run so smoothly. It's a conversation I know that you four will continue to have with others. And hopefully, you know, this evening has done a little piece to shine more light on this really crucial issue. So thank you all. And thanks to all of those who attended. And I hope you have a nice evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world.